Good evening. I'm Tina Greenberg, and welcome to the 109th Friends Forum. Since 1930, the Institute, and since 1980, the Friends of the Institute have received the benefit of the world's greatest scholars and talks on some of the most arcane, interesting, and complicated subjects. Tonight, we welcome Yve-Alain Bois, who has spent his life explaining to the world the works and work of some of the greatest painters of the 20th century. Tonight, we are especially pleased to welcome his thoughts on one of the most important artists of the 20th and 21st century, Ellsworth Kelly. It is altogether appropriate that we hear Professor Bois in this room, a room graced by Kelly's brilliant prints over here, and you should know that Dr. Bois was completely responsible for the long-term loan of this exquisite example of Kelly's works. Professor Bois is a critic, a curator, and a historian of art. He received his PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in 1977, and after that, Professor Bois has taken the usual academic track: Johns Hopkins, Princeton, Harvard, and the Institute. And has received world acclaim for his scholarly achievements, having received, among other prizes, the Alfred H. Barr Award for Museum Scholarship and the Chevalier des Arts from the government of France. He is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author and curator of some of the best received works and exhibitions of Matisse, Picasso, Mondrian, Barnett Newman, and of course, Ellsworth Kelly. Professor Bois.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. I have to correct you on one point, as always. I never taught at Princeton. Yes, I'm a professor decorative, on their masthead to attract graduate students, I suppose. So I'd like to start with a personal anecdote, hoping that it won't sound too vain on my part. The anecdote begins way back, for Kelly is one of the very first artists whose work I liked, maybe the second. The first was Piet Mondrian, and as you'll see, this is not irrelevant to what I'll try to say here. One of the things that I asked Kelly after we finally met and had become friends close to a quarter of a century ago was why he had not answered a fan letter that I'd written to him in my teens. He remembered the letter. He had received it at a time where he felt isolated, bypassed by a new generation of artists, and he had been struck by the fact that it came from a French teenager living in the middle of nowhere. He thought he might have kept it even. And since Kelly is a demon archivist, he did find the darn letter and gave me a copy of it, which, unlike him, I immediately misplaced. But I read it, and it was humbling. First, because I realized that I had misdated it in my memory, placing it 3 years too early, probably because the main event it described, my first encounter with works of his, a show of his lithographs at the Galerie Adrien Mag in Paris, but that thing should come and it doesn't. Am I doing something wrong? There you comes the problem. Am I doing anything? Ow! See, might be a world, renowned scholar, as you say, but not anything to do with clip. Yeah, that show dated from earlier even than my letter, 1965. Second, it was humbling because it was sheer adolescent drivel. At the time of the letter, Kelly was for me the purest representative of pure abstraction, whatever that's supposed to be. This interpretation was in fact reinforced by a groundbreaking essay on the artist's French years written by John Copeland, which is one of the first things I read when arriving in America as an exchange student in the summer of 1969. The essay was published in the journal Art Forum, of which Copeland was the chief editor, in that summer's issue. And in those years, though it's hard to imagine today, one could find the journal in as remote a location as Hanover, PA, where, oddly enough, I had landed. Copeland, in his excellent article, had said nothing of the figurative origin of the many works he was describing and publishing for the first time. So I was utterly dumbfounded when I read the expanded, rather rewritten version of this text in a monograph published only 2 years later, in 1971. I felt literally betrayed by Copeland, certainly, but even more so by the artist himself. When I read about the real sources of the pictures reproduced in the book, and which I had greatly admired. Too many art historians were always ready to deny the existence of abstraction, reading abstract paintings as if they were little rebuses one could simply decode, just as the iconologist decodes the hidden textual meaning of a Renaissance painting. I found it devastating that an artist which I had always deemed a champion of abstraction would unabashedly admit that the three horizontal bands of a multi-panel painting, in fact, was referring to the colors of fields seen from a train. It's called Train Landscape from 1952. Or that the black lines on a folded screen were renditions of the cast shadows of a railing on a metallic stairway. That's a painting from 1950-51. Or that his first masterpiece, earlier known as Construction, Relief in White, Grey and White, was now to be rebaptized Window, Museum of Modern Art, Paris, since it was the most exact duplicate in reduced size of one of the windows of the old pre-Beaubourg Musée National d'Art Moderne, the painting from 1949. Feeling betrayed, I sulked for a while, like teenagers do, and then moved on to other things, forgetting about Kelly's high treason, but also not paying as much attention to his work as I should have for many years. Then suddenly, while I was teaching at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, I was plunged back into Kelly land when visiting the touring retrospective exhibition of his drawings organized by Dine Upright, which came to the Baltimore Museum of Art in 1988. It is then that I really discovered Kelly's early graphic production. My teenage militancy about pure abstraction had vanished long ago. I had become an art historian in the meantime, and I knew by then that it was a completely inept notion. Seeing the drawings, and thus being offered a glimpse at the process of formation of the paintings, I realized that the figurative source of many French pictures did not make of these pictures the stylization or the distillation of a spectacle seen in the world. I did not understand exactly why this was so, but I was determined to find out. It is only a year and a half later that I was invited to do so. In late 1889, early 1990, I was asked to write an essay for the catalogue of the exhibition of Kelly's French years, 1948-1954, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Galerie du Jeu de Paume in Paris, an invitation I immediately accepted. This was soon followed by a first visit to Kelly's studio in Spencertown in upstate New York, and then many others, and it is during the year-long intermittent discussion we conduct on his Parisian works that I gradually came to understand the function of the figurative origin of many of the French paintings and reliefs. How it had nothing to do with representation, but rather with a non-compositional system which I call the transfer, and in turn, how this relates to other non-compositional strategies in the work of this period. I'll come with it in an instant. In short, I had finally been able to absolve Kelly from the high crime and misdemeanor I had been accusing him of as a teenage prosecutor. The intellectual, visual, and affective pleasure I took in granting this absolution was only the beginning of a wonderful friendship. Now, it might seem strange to you that, especially in a room containing prints made on this century, I would want to walk you through Kelly's earlier year in Paris. But my hope is that you'll gradually come to agree that there is no better introduction to his work, especially when it comes to understand why things that look apparently very simple are in fact much more complex than they seem. This is something that we usually accept from science. I don't think anyone doubts that a hyper-simple equation E equals mc2 is a tip of immensely complicated iceberg, but we usually have a harder time accepting it from art. So Kelly arrived in Paris in October 1948 on a GI Bill. He had studied 2 years at the Boston Museum School and had grown fed up of painting nudes in live model classes day in and day out. Ironically, he had to register to the École des Beaux-Arts in order to get his monthly check and paint one more nude to be accepted. He did it effortlessly, but that was his farewell to the traditional cursus, and he never set foot again at the school, where there was his good luck, no one ever took attendance. He had grown fascinated by medieval art while in Boston, and his first months in France were spent visiting as many sites of Romanesque architecture as he could on a limited budget, or in taking refuge from the cold at the Byzantine Institute, an outpost from Harvard located next to his hotel, where he looked at illustrated manuscripts as well as reports about the conservation of Hagia Sophia's mosaics. But then came the time where he had to start doing his own stuff. He was an ambitious 25-year-old would-be artist. Transitioning could not last forever. So I'll speed up now and cut to the chase. As I mentioned just a while ago, in his French years, Kelly was involved in non-compositional strategies. I mean by this that he was exploring ways in which he could make a painting without having to invent a composition, without having to involve his subjective taste or agency, without having to decide where to place things and in which order on his canvas. As a reminder, the verb to compose comes from the Latin componere, literally to put together. Composition in art was theorized during the Italian Renaissance by Alberti, who borrowed a well-established model from rhetoric that provided rules for all parts of discourse, down to the unit of the clause, and in particular, the hierarchical relation between the principal cause of the sentence and its subordinates. Now, there are several reasons why young artists working in Europe at this moment of history should want to do that, which amount to deflating his ego. As I see it, it has a lot to do with his dissatisfaction for the romantic and modernist conception of art as self-expression, as a marker of one's authorship. Three factors have to be taken into consideration here. One is personal and has directly to do with Kelly's interest in medieval art, and in particular Romanesque architecture, which he took to be the work of utterly anonymous craftsmen. Let's say that it is a different kind of romanticism that is involved here. The two other factors are contextual. First, let's remember that World War I had just come to a close. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust and Hiroshima, it comes as little surprise that young painters would ask, what does it mean to be an artistic subject, an author, at the very moment when the humanity of any individual has been cast in doubt by the massive demonstration of the inhumanity of our whole species? Second, any artist trying to affirm his selfhood in post-war Paris could not but have been sensitive to the fact that the road was blocked by a monster, by a kind of minotaur who was eating alive anyone approaching, a monster that had already invented everything, or so it was thought at the time. This monster was Picasso, and there was no way one could invent better than him, compose better than him. There was no way one could be original, personal, in short, a modern artist with his titan around. Sooner or later, you would discover in his gigantic output of more than 50,000 images that something you thought yours truly had already been done by the master, done by the master. In short, he had claimed as is all the space of inventiveness. If you started out by erasing yourself, your personality, your genius, and the like, if you started out by pretending you were not there, nobody would be able to come and say that Picasso did it better. There was one thing that Picasso did not know how to do, that was how to erase himself, how not to invent, how not to compose. So, during all his stay in France, Kelly would systematically explore several strategies of non-inventing, of not composing, of not taking decisions. He applied himself to invent ways not to invent, and he found out that the number of possibilities were limited. He came up with 5, although he fully exploited only 4 at the time, keeping in reserve the 5th, which would only become his landmark much later. I already mentioned one of the 4, the transfer, which I'll explain much later. But there would also be chance. This is a painting called November Painting, made by letting pieces of a tron drawing falling on the ground and duplicating that on canvas. There's change, there's a grid. This is a painting from 1951 called Color for a Large Wall, which is now at Museum of Modern Art. There was also the monochrome panel as unit. It's a painting called Painting for a White Wall from 1952. And the extra 5th one, which I call the Silhouette, which is the first one of that. It's based on it's a painting, actually a wood panel made in 55, but based on a drawing, on a collage you see in black which dates from 1951. So this silhouette this strategy of the silhouette encompasses this numerous shaped canvas and many reliefs from the early 70s to this day, as well as many of his prints, such as the one that are hung on the side wall of that room. Now, these non-compositional strategies, transfer, chance, grid, monochrome panel, silhouette, are not unique of Kelly, though he was certainly the first to use the transfer so forcefully. But what is unique of him is that he used them all in Paris in relatively short succession. They yielded formal results that were so diverse and Kelly was so productive at the time that the Ariadne thread of non-compositionality that linked almost all the works he produced in France was completely missed, even by his greatest admirers, until quite recently. In fact, this very diversity leads me to correct myself here. I said that Kelly used all these non-compositional strategies in relatively short succession. But this phrase is only accurate if one considers the original appearance, the first appearance of each of these strategies in his oeuvre. Indeed, the sequence of their invention as a logic that has explored at great length elsewhere in the National Gallery catalogue I mentioned before, the exploration of change following that of transfer, of grid, that of chance, of a monochrome panel as unit, that of the grid, and of the silhouette, that of the monochrome panel. But that doesn't mean that he ever abandoned a strategy after having stumbled upon the next one as its dialectical offspring. Just as he kept my teenage fan letter, Kelly keeps everything in store or on his back burner, happy to return to anything he suddenly fancies in his immense repertoire whenever he feels like it. I'll give you two examples. Well, I think it's two, maybe it's more. Here's a painting, the red one, or rather a relief, dating from 2002, yet it is based on a piece of folded paper he picked up in the streets around 1955 and that he pasted on one of the handed boards he kept as a source material. This collection of boards he called tablet. On the same board, actually, you can see a sketch probably dating from the early 70s that led to a more elaborate drawing in pencil, which dates from 1978, which is a sketch for a relief that was not realized, but which he picked up again in 1986 for a green-shaped canvas, which in turn he took to be as a basis for several prints of 2001, some of which are in this room. And again, for a two-panel relief, red over white, that was made last year. Or I'll give you more example, actually. This relief in gold paint and orange, or just a few months ago, the first time ever Kelly used metallic paint, based on a small collage dating from 1962. Or finally, this painting of 2007, based on a 2005 lithograph that you can see in this room, the two of them probably stemming from sketches dating from at least as early as the 70s. Now, Kelly's remarkable free attitude toward his past oeuvre, this capacity to revive any moment of it at any moment, without any chronological consideration for development, or so it seems at first at least, is something that has often puzzled critics, and I must say it's quite unique of his. But such a puzzlement, which is closely linked to the one I just mentioned about the diversity of Kelly's production in France, ought to disappear once we understand why these early years are so crucial. It is a time when the artist elaborated his fundamental matrix, to use the expression used by my friend and fellow Kelly admirer, Benjamin Buchloh. This matrix is a sum of the 4 and then 5 strategies that I identified. One could even say that it is a product rather than a sum of those strategies, for the taxonomy I proposed is porous. Here are some examples of this porosity. In the automatic drawings done on an old bus in the south of France and registering the effect of every bump on the road on the bus's poor suspension, dating from 1950, we have chance, but also the recourse to the kind of indexicality, to use a linguistic concept, that is more typical of the transfer. It is a non-subjective record. It records the bumps. Transfer and chance are even more clearly intertwined in glue spots, also drawing from 1950, for which the artist simply inked in black the messy traces of glue that covered the sheet of brown paper protecting the table on which he was making his collage. In many grids, most of them actually, the distribution of squares is organized by chance. And here you have the system that he chance system that he used for making this painting called Seine from 1971, which is now in the Museum of Art in Philadelphia, a gift of the artist in honor of Anne d'Arnoncourt. Kelly's rectangular monochrome panel units are always part of a grid, since with one exception, Tableau Vert here from 1952, which is the only painting with some atmospheric depth in all of Kelly's oeuvre. With this exception, they are never solitary and always aligned to at least two neighbors. Many sketched from multi-panel paintings, collages made in Sannery in south of France, but eventually not realized, partake of a particular kind of transfer, not often used by Kelly, the close-up, in which the image becomes congruent with the field by way of cropping. And so he was looking at boats in the harbor and decided to make this, cropping. And finally, if irregularly shaped, a single monochrome panel becomes a silhouette, an essential part of Kelly's vocabulary, as I mentioned before, from the early 70s on. Now, given that I can't speak about all the 5 non-compositional strategies I've identified, I'll skip chance, grid, and the monochrome, which became staples of 20th century art and whose principles are pretty straightforward. And I'll be short on the silhouette. I'll mostly focus on the notion of transfer, in the hope that my remarks will help dissipate what has become, according to me, a common misinterpretation of Kelly's work by most of his critics. The principle of the transfer is very simple. Rather than composing ex nihilo, the artist selects in the world at large a patterned and flat surface that he reproduces as such on his canvas. He does not represent it, but transfers it as one would do a rubbing of a tombstone inscription. You should know that this technique was used by archaeologists before the invention of photography, and it is at least 2,000 years old in China. Although the line separating a representation and a transfer is materially very thin, it is conceptually a major one. And I'll show you 2 pairs of illustrations to clarify this issue. The first pair is made of 2 Kelly drawings immediately preceding Window Museum of Modern Art. One is a view. The opened window frame is seen in perspective. Space is represented. The other is a tracing, so to speak, the one of the broken glass. A tracing, like a camera-less photograph that one does by placing objects on photosensitive paper. In the drawing of the open window, there is space, schematically represented by the perspectival foreshortening of the left window pane, which means that we, as beholders, are positioned at a certain distance from the window. We are assigned a point of view. This is not a realist representation by any means, but we are given a point of view. In the drawing of the broken pane of the same window, of the same hotel room in which Kelly was living in 1949, there is, on the contrary, no distance, no space, no point of view whatsoever. It's like a rubbing. The second pair I propose draws from other artists. The most celebrated transfer in American art is certainly Jasper Johns' Flag, which dates from several years after Kelly had completed his inaugural investigation of this method, something that should be more readily acknowledged. In fact, Johns began his own investigation exactly when Kelly came back in the US with many early transfer works in his luggage. Now, when placed next to Monet's celebration of the 14th of July, it is obvious, I hope, that Johns' flag is not the mere representation of a flag, but the exact copy of a flattened flag on a field that it covers entirely. The field does not contain an image, but the image and the field are one. The major difference in the case of Kelly's early work, of course, is that the artist did not want you to know the source of the image. It is only much later that this was revealed, as I had already mentioned, with reference to Copland's book. The issue for Kelly was to produce abstract paintings whose formal organization would be non-intentional, would be a given, so to speak. But that is far less easily done than said. In fact, it is while stumbling on a series of drawings that never evolved into a painting that I understood the difficulty of the task the young Kelly was set for himself. In those drawings, made during the summer of 1950, he gave himself up with the passion of an entomologist to registering and transferring in their most minute details the patterns of the cloth sides of beach cabanas. Now, if Kelly liked so much the cabanas he saw on the beach of Méché, a small resort of the Atlantic coast of France, it is of course because it provided him with already made compositions, which is another way to say non-compositions, as you must have guessed by now. Once again, Kelly did not try to represent the cabins, he is not Monet at Trouville, but he took from them the pattern offered by their surfaces. There is an element of historical specificity here that surely added to the charm of these non-compositions for him, since the patterns were created by hasty repairs made immediately after the war when there was still a shortage of material. But more importantly, he found in these cabins the ideal non-composition. The surfaces he was transferring were even canvases already. He had nothing to decide, not even when to stop and where to start. The image was congruent to the field. He didn't have even to think about how to frame the motif. He didn't have anything to do, really. He had found an already framed motif that proved that he could make an abstract painting without inventing anything. The interesting thing, of course, is that it did not work. As a cutout, Kelly little by little eliminated the neutral elements, the regular stripes, and noted only the marked elements, the repairs. It was the squawks of these patched additions, sometimes differently colored, that had struck him in the first place, and it is those that he transferred in the only collage he made after the drawings. This large collage explained why no painting came of the Beach Cabana campaign. Without the regular stripes, the additions perturb, the non-composition becomes not only a composition, but also a bad composition. It looks intentional, something like a Baroque version of Motherwell's Little Spanish Prison. Now, it is happy that Kelly had disobeyed his own rule of not adding or subtracting anything in a surface he was transferring, and that he had intervened in the transfer by omitting the stripes. For the failure proved extraordinarily productive. It made him understood that the limits of the method. There was no way to fundamentally distinguish between the not composed transfer of beach cabanas and a painting by Motherwell, that is, highly composed, high modernist abstract canvas. Then it was obvious that the method was neither foolproof nor easy to use. And in fact, a critical misinterpretation of Kelly's work at the time confirmed to him that he might have to abandon the method or at least loosen it. The critic Michel Sephore paid him a visit in his tiny hotel room studio in the Ile Saint-Louis and singled out a relief called Antibes, which he thought resembled a work by Ben Nicholson, the British friend of Mondrian and pre-war pioneer of geometric abstraction, whom Kelly had never heard of at the time, he told Sephore. I wonder if he believed me, he wrote to his friend Ralph Coburn, adding, I can only tell you where I get my inspiration, and for that one it was something in nature which I just saw myself, and of course we arrive at the same thing as all the painters, being completely ignorant of them. But Sephore would not only compare Kelly to Ben Nicholson, he would also praise his work as one of the best, quote, best continuation of Mondrian's work. He was only the first of a long stream of art critics. This would become the standard critical account of Kelly's early production. It dominated the reception of his first show in New York at Betty Parsons in 1956, which included several of his French works. Understandably, delusioning the rare critics who admired his work was not on the top of Kelly's agenda during his stay in France. During his 5 years and a half there, he only sold one painting, and to a friend. So he was not going to tell a critic that you got it wrong. But upon his arrival in America, having to shift his identity from that of a dirt-poor expat to that of a dirt-poor newcomer in New York art world, he might have felt a strong need to straighten the record. It is probably what he tried to achieve during one of his first encounters with that art world after his return to the US. Here's the story. Alexander Calder, whom he had met and befriended in Paris, had written a letter recommending Kelly to Alfred Barr and urging the formidable chief curator of the painting and sculpture department at MoMA to go visit the young painter's studio. Probably overbooked and exhausted, Barr wrote in return to Kelly asking him to bring a few of his works to the museum, which was done, but quite reluctantly. I mean, the whole story is funny, but the selection is interesting in that, except for the grid, it presented a complete sampling of what Kelly had done until then, all the while demonstrating that his work was fundamentally different from that of Mondrian, which is perhaps why the grid was omitted. Some of the works are already familiar to you, as I've shown them before. November Painting and Window. Not shown with this title, of course. It was called Black and White Relief. Then there was Dominican, which is not exactly a multi-panel painting, but almost. Then there was Red, Yellow, Blue, White, and Black of 1952. And you notice the primary colors. Needless to say, their use differs completely from the type of balancing ones that one sees in Mondrian's work. Here they appear like names in a dictionary or samples in a paint shop. Then there was Black Curves and Yellow Curves of 1954, the first two paintings that Kelly had made arriving in New York. Curves, quite non-Mondrian-like as well. Now, Barr probably got the message that Kelly indeed was no follower of Mondrian, but he did not see beyond the formal variety of the works presented to him and probably thought that this was a symptom of immaturity. Too bad for MoMA and its trustees, would later spend considerable sums of money to acquire, if not always his exact works, at least some of their peers. And if Barr got the message, he was quite alone at that, as the early reception of Kelly in America makes clear. Reviews in which he is endlessly assimilated to geometric European art, and thus, at least indirectly, but often nominally, to Mondrian. This might explain why the artist, in 1958, embarked in what would become a very steady exploration of a triad red, blue, green, in direct defiance of the neoplastic taboo against green. This is a painting from 1958 called Mask, an exploration that he pursued with increasing intensity until 1965 and revived in a typical Kelly fashion in a large painting, multi-panel painting of 2002. In insight, it might seem very strange that Mondrian, the 20th century master of compositional balance, if there is one, at least during the classical phase of neoplasticism until 1932, would have been invoked as a pictorial mentor of young Kelly, the enfant terrible of non-composition. But the reason might be that the production of both artists faced, and still faces to some extent, a common misinterpretation, in which the abstractness of their work is denied, in which their works are seen as figurative or representational. I don't have the time yet to develop on Mondrian. Suffice it to say that Kelly's works enact indeed a very different concept of abstraction than Mondrian, since it can't encompass a transfer within its matrix. But these works are essentially abstract, and certainly not representational. But even for works for which one can say that they contain some imagery, it is often quasi-random secondary effect, a byproduct of these various work processes. For example, that of the close-up mentioned earlier. Tricot and Maillot Jaune of 1957, for example, are based on a sketch of what Kelly was seeing while sitting in an armchair to the aperture of a window in his studio. He remembers it as an advertisement for Knickerbocker beer on the wall on the other side of the street. Once again, it is the flat pattern that caught his eye, a pattern he could easily transfer. It is only after the fact that he associated these shapes with the image of a tank top and thought the association droll enough to convey it in the title of these two works. Plus also there was a Tour de France and it was nostalgic. In other words, Kelly does not need imagery, but he does not shun it either. The grid is as much already made as a common trope of modernism as the window of the Musée National d'Art Moderne. As already made material, they all are just to his vociferous mill, fuel to his production engine, the matrix, which is as an endlessly open system. So open, in fact, that it is often something in the world at large that suddenly begins to look Kelly-like. Most of his photographs actually enact this reversal. But it should be underlined that he does not consider them artworks. So afraid is he, and alas, rightly so, that people would read his oblique shot of a new concrete flagstone or sidewalk, on a sidewalk, or his frontal view of an old barn for the referent or motifs of his work, in the sense that the Montagne Sainte-Victoire is a motif of Cézanne's series of paintings on the theme. Kelly doesn't want that at all. And in fact, he absolutely refused to exhibit these photos in a gallery, despite the constant push from it by his dealer. Any work of art by another artist, as well as past one by himself, but that's rarer, can be submitted to the same dissolution of its identity and become prey to the matrix. Visiting an exhibition of paintings with Kelly is often to be alerted by him to this or that particular shape, generally interstitial between things in a painting, or this or that color combination. These are shapes or color combination that one has failed to notice before, and that's because in order to perceive them, one has to forget the image, something he can do effortlessly, because the real background against which these shapes and color combinations stand out for him is not the picture from which his perception accepts them, but the vast mental storage in which he keeps everything his matrix has produced, including, as I mentioned before, tiny little sketches made years before for paintings, reliefs, or sculptures that were not realized. I remember specifically joking with him while visiting an exhibition of Van Gogh's portraits in his company in Boston, and hearing him associate a detail of one of the canvases on view to one of his recent works. That he should, I joke with him that he should make sure to remember that Van Gogh had not copied him. Though, in fact, one could say that Van Gogh is in debt to Kelly, not Van Gogh the long dead man, but Van Gogh the oeuvre as we see it now, benefiting from Kelly's work as well as that from many other artists of the 20th century, but that is the story of modernism as a whole. Now, I would like to briefly wrap up the issue of imagery and referentiality, or rather lack thereof, in Kelly's procedure. As I mentioned at the outset, Kelly was at first shy about revealing the sources of his transfers. As a young, insecure artist, he felt that people would not understand his quest for impersonality, for non-agency. Then, during the heyday of minimalism in the 60s, and in order to differentiate himself from the younger artists of this movement, he revealed his method in the Copeland's book, which eventually led to the misconception that is rampant today, to the artist's regret, and which I'm trying to fend off. Was it a mistake then, via Copeland's, to have brought us in the loop? I don't think so, for in revealing the sources of his transfers, Kelly gave us the opportunity to understand that his quest had nothing to do with representation, but with denaturalization, defamiliarization. I have said earlier that a transfer is an index in a semiotic or linguistic conception of the term. It implies a relation of co-presence at some point between the sign and its referent, just as a footprint on the sand tells that a human being has been there. But in Kelly's transfer, this referentiality of the sign is denied, or at least not considered of the slightest interest. He likes shadows or reflections for the odd shapes. And the fact that these shapes are already made, and the fact that the shapes he likes shadows or reflections for the odd shapes, and for the fact that these shapes are already made, that didn't have to make them. But he's not concerned by the possibility of inferring from what it is that they are the shadows of, or the reflection of. So, for example, this is the painting, and he's not interested in you knowing that it comes from the same balustrade that I showed before in photograph. And those are drawings that he made in 1950, which basically is reflections of trees in the sand. If you don't know that they are reflections of trees, that's perfectly fine with them. In fact, he prefers you to know, not to know. This severing of the physical link between referent and indexical sign, which amounts to a splitting of the indexical sign from its usual function of communication, is what happens almost by itself in the particular mode of transfer that is cropping, as in the maillot jaune and tricot you saw earlier coming from Knickerbocker. What is cropping? Basically a photographic device well known to painters even before the invention of photography, and which they use in order to put the emphasis on the subjective point of view of the artist beholder, as, say, Degas would do by dramatically cutting off the edge of the visual field. Kelly's use of cropping has nothing to do with his pain to the subjective and transitory nature of experience, especially since, as one must always remember, that what he crops is always flat. And if it involves the visual field and not, as is most often the case, a particular surface of it, it is the visual field as perceived with only one eye. More importantly, perhaps, is the fact that the cropping is itself an involuntary accident, almost like a hiccup or a Freudian slip of the tongue. The sudden apparition of a shape as it strikes a chord for being unrecognizable or for being recognized as something the artist consciously knows it is not. Maillot jaune, 4 letters. Either this shape echoes something already cut in the web of the matrix, or it appeals to Kelly for its potentiality as a score for a new piece. But a score with material performance in the real world, and already made unperceived by anyone but him, is only the material proof that it can indeed exist on its own. The process by which the already made shape is suddenly available to Kelly, while it escapes most of us, is one of defamiliarization, of what the Russian formalist critics called ostranение. Sorry for this. I have to show off after all my knowledge. It came upon the young Kelly years before he became an artist, and the strong memories he has about several childhood experiences is perhaps the reason his work remains so fresh. I'll quote 2 of such memories, but there are many more. I mean, he's a very, very profuse talker, even though he always says he has nothing to say. I remember that when I was about 10 or 12 years old, I was ill and fainted. And when I came to, my head was upside down. I looked at the room upside down, and for a brief moment, I couldn't understand anything until my mind realized that I was upside down, and I righted myself. But for the moment I didn't know where I was. It was fascinating. It was like a wonderful world. And this other souvenir recalled by Hugh Davis, the director of the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art. On Halloween night in 1935 in rural Oradell, New Jersey, the 12-year-old Ellsworth Kelly was trick-or-treating with friends in a neighborhood after dark. Upon approaching a house from a distance, he said, "I saw 3 colored shapes, red, black, and blue, in a ground floor window. It confused me and I thought, what's that? When I got close to the window, it was too high to look in easily, and I didn't want to be peeking. I was very curious and came back at the window obliquely and chinned myself up, only to look into a normal furnished living room. When I backed off to the distance, there it was again. I now realized that it was probably my first abstract vision, something like the 3 shapes in your red-blue-green painting. Now, I hope that it is clear by now that the cropped view of a bourgeois interior seen by the young Kelly as peeping Tom is not the source of the San Diego painting. And that if I quote this passage as one of the head upside down, it is because they offer a perfect example of the kind of defamiliarization allowed by the matrix. A kind of defamiliarization wonderfully analyzed by Maurice Merleau-Ponty in The Phenomenology of Perception, which was a kind of Bible for the minimalist artists of the generation after Kelly. When Merleau-Ponty wrote that to put an object upside down is to remove its signification from it, and noted how difficult it is when walking along an avenue, I quote Merleau-Ponty again, to see the space between the trees as things and the trees themselves as background. Now, of course, Kelly's initial quest for impersonality ultimately failed. Nothing is more recognizable than a work of his, and nothing is more idiosyncratic than what he picks up as a foil for his art in the spectacle of the world at large. But in doing so, it teaches us that there are many more ways to see than we are prompt to admit. His art, among other things, is an injunction to explore in our own terms an expanded field of vision.